Well, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I cannot be there live, but we have a college event that I am at today. And when we scheduled this one, we didn't know when that event would be, and it just happened to be today. So apologies for not being there live. You're getting this basically Monday morning with me recording it. So I'm going to go ahead and close my email out so you don't hear people emailing me the whole time. But I'm Paul Geringer. I'm a senior faculty specialist and extension specialist in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics. And I'm going to talk to you today about some leasing basics and some common questions I get asked a lot. So we'll do the basics and then we'll end up with the common questions that I get asked a lot. And let me go ahead and share my screen. You guys should be seeing my PowerPoint now. Minimize myself. And leave that alone. I'm also part of the Ag Law Education Initiative. There's our information right there. We're funded by University of Maryland Empower. There's that information right there. Thank God this is recorded, so you guys will all see this. None of this is legal advice. You've heard me say this before. I'm going to keep going. So let's talk about the introduction. A lot of what I'm going to talk today about we're going to cover a number of legal issues I get questions on, but I'm going to give you a basic overview, as I said earlier, as well. So we'll talk about, some of the basics in leasing and everything else. What's a lease? And a lot of these slides I stole from when I teach my undergraduates, but I think I use them a lot in extension programming because I think they do a good job of just laying out what we're trying to think about when we're looking at lease. A lease is just a temporary right to hold real or personal property. If we think about it, we can lease real property, land, buildings, or we could lease personal property, equipment. Many people may be leasing tractors, but where I get the questions a lot are with leases involving land, not personal property. So the lease involves a leasee who is the tenant or the person holding that temporary right, or the lessor, and also the lessor, also known as the landlord. They're the one giving up that temporary right. They're giving it to somebody else. What are they different than? Well, it's different than a license, where that's just a right to use property but lacks, possession or real interest. My example almost always is, I have access to a parking lot here on campus. I don't have access to a spot in the same lot every day. If I'm not here early enough, that lot may fill up and I have to go somewhere else. So just because I have a right to park here doesn't mean I have a right to park in the same spot every day. I have to move and park in other lots potentially. Employment, it's not the same. Typically, there's no leasing relationship. There's a lack of possession and an interest in the property, and typically you're paying a wage in those cases. So we really have to pay attention to this, and this comes up a lot with a cropper or other people who are just doing work on the farmland, and they're not actually the tenant on the property. So why do we want to care about this? So if we look at the census of ag, 43% of all farmland in this state is leased, according to the most recent census. That doesn't include the equipment that's also leased. Nationwide, we see about 39% of all ag land is leased. Again, that doesn't include the equipment that's leased. So it's not the majority, but it's a big part of agriculture. We look at it, it's the easiest way for beginning farmers to get involved in this. So why do we want to lease? When I was an undergraduate and doing an advanced farm management class, the basic philosophy of the individual who came in to teach the class, he was not a faculty member there, but he was somebody who had a lot of experience in farm business management. He told us basically to lease everything. Why would you own anything? Lease it, lease it, lease it. It was antithetical to everything we had been taught, but it made sense. Your capital costs are lower. It's easier to dispose of the property than when you own it. So if you need to downsize, you can get rid of leased property real easily. Problem is, you may not always be able to lease that property again if you need to go back up. With personal property, allows us to get the newest equipment with less capital. It's easier to update equipment. It's much easier potentially to lease a tractor than buy a tractor in some cases. So what do we need to have a valid lease? Well, the first thing we need to think about is we need to have a valid contract. We're not really going to talk about what goes into a valid contract, but we need to have some sort of meeting of the minds that we actually have a contract in place. We also need to pay rent or be receiving rent, depending on which party we are. We need to have a transfer of a portion of the ownership rights to the tenant. So we look at it, we always teach property law as, you have this bundle of sticks, and each one of these bundles of sticks represents rights in the property. We're transferring some of that bundle over to the tenant. So the tenant may be getting the right to access the property, the right to farm it, the right to do certain stuff, but we may keep certain rights as the landlord. We may keep the right to come back on for recreational uses, hunting, fishing, hiking, whatever we want to do on the property. We may keep access to the woods, where we may want to do certain work within those. We may not lease the whole property. So we have to pay attention to what rights are being transferred to. That possession and control must be held by the tenant. The property must return to the owner at the end of the lease. If we have all that, we have a valid lease. So what are some typical clauses we would see in lease? Well, we're going to see a property description. Why do we want a property description? Well, we want to know what property is being leased. So it may be a physical address. It may be something based on meets and bounds. It may be something if you're outside more or less the 13 original colonies and in where the Jeffersonian grid system was put into place. We may have it set down by the Jeffersonian grid system. We want to know how long that lease is going to run. We need to know how many years or when that lease will terminate. We need to know all that. That's going to come to play here in a minute. We need to know what the rental rate is. I'll talk more about that in a minute. We're going to talk about other clauses that may go into it a little bit. Is there going to be expenses shared? Who's going to pay for what? Over time, this is particularly important if we're renting, pasture land in some cases, or cropland that needs certain practices put into place. Talk about how those could be shared. What about subleasing the property? Is that going to be allowed? Is it not going to be allowed? There's potentially going to be other clauses. We'll talk about one in particular when we get to growing crops here closer to the end. The first thing I want to tell you is almost always put this thing in writing. I'm going to come back to this later because this is almost always where I get my questions on the most. Why do we want to have, why do people do oral verbal leases? Well, they're simple. Most we're going to have is a rent and a lease term clause. There's generally no other clauses. Why? Because, that's about the most our memories are going to hold over time. And if we wanted a complex lease, we put it in writing. We also like to show trust in each other. We think that by just having these simple handshake deals, everyone's going to live up to it. But the problem is, we lease these properties potentially for long periods of time. They could be in the part of a family for multiple generations. And I don't just mean the family owning the farmland. I mean the family farming the farmland as well. Could be multiple generations farming a piece of property that is leased. Multiple generations could pass away and not remember what the original terms were. That is one of the biggest problems with these. We may not always remember, we may not always meet legal requirements that we'll talk about here in a minute. We have no written record, and because of that, we have no reminder of what was agreed upon. So any dispute rests upon which party is believable and which one's not. And we may have to go back and say, like, well, grandpa agreed to this and their grandpa agreed to this. So this creates issues when we're trying to figure out what past generations agreed to. Why do we want to have a written lease? Well, we have a written record. Think of all the cons I just told you. In verbal leases, we can turn those around and make them pros here. We have a written record. We have parties that have negotiated and more fully developed the lease. We clearly define who's responsible for what. It's a good business practice. Lenders are potentially going to require this just so they can verify and have on file proof that you actually have the acreage you claim to have under lease. They're going to want that for auditors purposes potentially. So they're going to want to see this or have something in writing to show you have that. It may not always have to be a lease, but you're going to have to do something. What are the cons? They don't show the same level of trust. But I would disagree. with that. I would say we show a bigger level of trust because now we've thought about this more clearly. We know what we want to do. You should always recognize with these written leases, you're never going to fix every problem. We're fixing problems that we think might happen, but we may not fix everything. There may be potential times you don't want a written record of what you agreed to. I can think of certain cases from stuff I've dealt with in the past where you might not want to, but that may be one reason you don't want that. The other reason we want to do this is state law. Almost all states have what is known as a statute of frauds. Statutes of frauds are this idea we took from England when we were colonies and when we just adopted them over here at the Revolution. So state law almost always requires, no matter the state, that leases for an interest in real property longer than 1 year need to be in writing. It also requires contracts that cannot be completed in 1 year to be in writing. So I'm going to give you some examples here quickly, and you think about them and tell me, you can put in the chat box. I won't see if you're right or wrong, but I'll pause a little bit so we can determine if what you're thinking. So my first example is we have a lease that runs from January 1, 2018 to December 31st, 2018. Should we put that one in writing? It's a 1-year lease. The answer is it does not require to be put in writing. It can be oral, but you probably should put it in writing just to be safe. What if we have a lease, and this is a pretty common lease term within agriculture, January 1, 2018 to December 31st, 2018, and continue after December 31st, 2018 until terminated by one of the parties. Is that a 1-year lease or a multi-year lease? I'll pause and let you think about that for a second. That is not required to be in writing. Hit the button a little too quickly. That is not required to be in writing. Why is it not required to be in writing? Well, if we look at the first statement, it's from January 1 to December 31st. The lease could end on December 31st, so it's a 1-year lease. We don't know if it's going to continue after December 31st. If it continues after December 31st, it just becomes a 1-year lease that's continually renewed. So in the court's eyes, when they look at this, this does not have to be in writing. This is the most common lease term we deal with in agriculture. They are almost always written this way. And no one puts them in writing, and this is where we almost always come up with the problems. You might think you're going to be special and there's going to be no problems. You might be. But you also might be on the losing end where there are problems. So it's almost always a good idea. If we're going to have this, we put it in writing. What about this? We have a lease that goes from January 21 till the end of this year, or January 1, 2020 to the end of this year, 2-year lease. That definitely needs to be in writing. That is a 2-year lease. That falls within the statute of frauds. That needs to be in writing. There are ways around this when we get into a lease that typically we can get around this. If there's been substantial performance, we may be able to show what has been done to get around the writing requirement. But in most cases, it's always good just to get it in writing. We don't want to worry if we fall into some exceptions to the statute of frauds. I'm not going to talk about those today because those can get confusing, but we really do need to get these in writing. So tenancies, what are the type of tenancies? Tenancy year to year or periodic tenancy can go indefinitely until proper termination is given. That's my example of going for 1 year and then continuing till terminated by one of the parties. That is a typical ag lease. Tenancy for years or for a term is measured by a period of time, lasts as long as a period of time. We have a lease, like my second example, my third example, that 2-year lease, that's a tenancy for years or for a term. My first example for 1 year, that's a tenancy for term. My second example is the first one, tenancy year to year. So those are the most common types of ag tenancies. There's different kinds too, but that's what we need to be aware of. The other ones we need to be aware of is we may have had the lease end at any time. That's a tenancy at will. It just may say you lease this as long as you want, as long as we both agree you get to do it. Then we have a tenancy at the sufferance. You are a holdover tenant at this point. This is when the lease has definitely ended and you don't leave if you are the tenant. So I always use the example with my students, your lease ends on your apartment, but you continue to live in the apartment. You continue to pay the rent. You are a holdover tenant. The landlord can continue this to go on. It becomes a year-to-year tenancy at that point, or the landlord can get you removed through a legal process to do that. So that's the way that operates. Now, moving on, what about economic gain? In ag, we got 3 types of leases. We got crop share, we got fixed cash, we got flex cash. So each provides some sort of economic gain. Each requires different levels of record keeping. Fixed cash, easiest to set up. Crop share, flex cash, a little more record keeping, a little more monitoring goes into that. Talk about the easiest one first. Fixed cash is a payment per acre per year to rent the farmland. Landlord is not at risk in this. There's no risk of loss. Other types will have risk of loss involved in those, or other risk involved in those. Landlord just gets paid. Tenant carries all the risk in this. I'm using some GIFs, at least this one GIF that Elizabeth Domini, who works with me, put together, showing how crop share or the crop rental rates for non-irrigated land have changed over the years. And if you notice, every now and again, as it goes through, there's like years missing and counties are blank. That's because we really didn't have data for those counties at that point. This is all based off NAS surveys. And if you didn't respond to the survey, we don't know what it is at that point. Crop share leases. The split seems to be based on tradition in most areas. Talk or ask around, you'll get what the basic level is. Sometimes it's 60-40, sometimes it's 70-30, sometimes it's different. Just have to ask around in your area. I don't keep track of that. This will require detailed record keeping to know, for the tenant, need to know the exact amount of inputs and the costs used on the farm. Why are we doing that? Because the parties typically split based on whatever the crop share split is. Those input costs that are either agreed upon that increase yield or just those that increase yield. So we have to go back at the end, split that. We'll typically split the crop insurance payments, at least the cost of crop insurance, because if the crop fails, the landlord's at risk of loss, so the landlord qualifies for crop insurance. So we'll keep that as well and split that among the parties just in case. So like I said, 60-40, the tenant takes 60% of the crop, landlord takes 40% of the crop. Landlord will also pay 40% of costs for fertilizers, chemicals, and anything that can be documented to increase yield that needs to be done on the crop. The last type of economic gain, it's flex cash. Flex cash is slowly replacing crop insurance, mainly because it's making record keeping easier in farming operations, and it's making record keeping easier when we're dealing with multiple landlords on the same property. So if we're dealing with multiple family members owning a piece of ground and we're having to individually pay each one of those, and some do want to be paid, think about it, some siblings do not get along, so they might not trust the other sibling to give them their payment on time, and they will want the tenant to pay them directly. So we may be paying multiple tenants or expecting money to come in from multiple landlords, or paying out to multiple landlords, excuse me. So what do we do this? Well, what we do is we will I'll explain it here in a second. I got some examples, but we will flex it based on either crop price, yield, gross revenue. We can do anything really, and we can set this to be flexed on multiples of these, depending on what you want to do. So think about, you're setting this up in a way, you may want to pick multiple factors to do this because it may benefit you depending on which party you are in this. So typically we set a base rent, and typically it's going to be slightly less than the cash rent, or it could be about the cash rent for the farm. Then you set the base you will flex off of. So you'll set either a base yield, a base crop price, a base gross revenue. And this could just be historically what we've gotten on the farm. So it could be the historic yield off that farm. It could be the historic, average crop price for the past 5 years. It could be the base, average gross revenue for the farm for the past 5 years as well. You pick that. And then finally, you set a settlement date, i.e. the date all these calculations will be based off of. So, oh, slide repeated itself. Apparently I screwed up and did delete something. So base rent. This is my example. Got $100 base cash rent per acre. Yield is 105 bushels per acre. A corn, and you're renting 100 acres. Try to keep this easy. The actual yield is 130 bushels per acre. Okay, our historic yield is 105. So we go ahead and we do $100 times 130 divided by 105 equals 123.81. So basically, seeing how this goes, everybody getting it so far? Yeah. So our rent's going to be, for the 100 acres, will be $12,381. Typically, we will have it set to where the base rent is the bottom. Some of these will be set to where if this actual yield is below 105, that can fall below. That creates problems with USDA program payments to where potentially now we have to open the landlord up to crop insurance and other program payments where they might not have been eligible in the past because now they're at risk of loss. So typically we will keep it to where there is no risk of loss and there is a base that they will be paid. But we can set it up with risk of loss involved in this. Does that make sense? We do this with anything. I keep this simple. I don't add multiple factors in. There's some examples I'll show at the end where you can look at that. So let's go back to these common leasing questions that I get asked a lot. So what happens if this landlord sells the property? Okay. What happens if there's growing crops at the end of the lease? And does the landlord retain the right to re-enter the property? In some form or fashion, I get a call on this, once a week, once every 2 weeks, depending on the time of year and depending on what's going on. So if the landlord sells the property during the life of the lease, the new tenant or the new landlord steps into the role of the previous landlord. The new landlord becomes the new landlord, or the new landowner becomes the new landlord. Make sense? Nothing changes the lease. If the landlord didn't know, or the new landowner didn't know about the lease, it doesn't end the lease. The old landowner should have made them aware of the lease. And if they saw farmland being farmed and knew the previous owner wasn't anybody involved in agriculture, they should probably have asked questions. So there's abilities where, people should have been put on notice and they should have figured this out. The tenant will make rental payment to the new landowner and the lease is still valid. Now, what happens if that new landlord wants to get rid of you? They have to give you 180 days notice to terminate the lease. This changes from the old 6 months notice requirement that had previously been in place about 2021. They changed this to this 18-day notice. But if you take 6 times 30, average 30 days in a month, we get 180. So we really didn't change anything. Now all we're doing is doing it by a day's calculation and not months. So in other words, it changes it by about a day. We move the notice of termination up really to July 1. Or June 30th, pardon me. It's June 30th. We really need to be about there giving notice. Note, I say that 180 day can really be modified by written lease. I've talked to some folks who think that might be slightly hard. We have never had a case on that in the state, but that may be a little harder. So it's almost always good that we keep this as a base and, add that 180 as a base, and we might extend it slightly, but we might not want to go lower than that because that could create issues if the tenant did take us to court on it. But in a lot of states, when we've looked at ag leases with shorter than state law requirements, courts have almost always been willing to go with the lesser period agreed upon by the parties. So that's something we need to be aware of. That may work in other states. It may not work here just based on our court's history of being a slightly more pro-tenant than they are in other states. If there is a written lease, make sure the new landowner gets a copy of it. The previous landowner may have not done that. Next question I get in a lot, especially right around, the growing season. What happens if I have growing crops and the landowner wants to terminate the lease? The common law view was if you had a definite termination date, then you're not entitled to plant the crops. And I have to point this out. I point this out every time this GIF shows up. I love this GIF with my undergraduate class because I use it all the time on slides where I know they're going to be involved in the test as a cue for them when they're going through the notes to find them and look for them. Now, the first thing I need to point out on this, because I didn't put it on the slide, is in almost all cases, if we go back to that slide I talked about earlier, where the lease goes for 1 year and then continues on until terminated by one of the parties, we are now out of definite termination date. Almost all ag leases do not have a definite termination date unless they definitely say they end at a certain date. There's an exception to this. We have this doctrine within the common law. This doctrine is this idea that we want to protect lessees in certain cases. And they're pretty limited in how we're going to settle it. Under this doctrine, a former tenant has the right to re-enter the lease property to cultivate, harvest, and remove crops that were planted prior to the termination of the tenancy. To be entitled to this doctrine, we have to have a tenancy for an uncertain duration. As I just said, once we have a tenancy that says it will continue on past the 1 year point until terminated by one of the parties, we have a tenancy for an uncertain duration. If we're still in that one first year period and the landlord gives notice, that might be a little harder to make the case that it's uncertain, but because of that language, courts may look at that situation and say, that's a little uncertain. We didn't know you were going to do that. It was an option, but in a lot of cases, it may not always happen. So we have to pay attention to that in that case. But once we move past that year period into that until terminated by one of the parties, we are now in an uncertain duration. The termination has to be due by either an act of God or by an act of the landlord, and the termination was no fault of the tenant and was done without his or her previous knowledge. The reason I say that is if the tenant did something wrong, the tenant can't be entitled to this doctrine. If the tenant wasn't paying rent, that's the tenant's fault that the lease was terminated. It's not the landlord's and it's not an act of God. The doctrine does not apply. If the tenant did something to violate the terms of the written lease, it's not, the landlord's fault or an act of God. That's the tenant's fault. The tenant doesn't get the doctrine. The tenant has to be blameless in all of this. And the crop had to be planted during the right to occupy the occupancy. The tenant cannot do this after notice of termination was given. The tenant can't do anything at that point. They may have already bought the seed. That's not going to get you this doctrine. It has to be planted before the notice was given. Typically only applies to annual crops, soybeans, corn, watermelons, wheat, stuff like that. It doesn't apply to perennial grasses. Why? You planted perennial grasses, hay, stuff like that on farmland that you knew you had a limited time to do. We'll only give you a certain period of time to do that. That's something that if you plant that perennial crop, you need to negotiate with the landlord on how you're going to be able to get that out later. The final question I get a lot of, and typically this comes up when the landlord has some development interest in the property. Unless there is a written provision in the lease, the landlord retains no right to enter the lease property. Landlords would typically need to check to make sure they're entering the property will not interfere with you. The reason I say this is in almost all cases, we never enforce this against the landlord. We want to continue leasing the property. We want to be seen as being helpful to the landlord. So in almost all cases, we will allow the landlord to come on the property whenever the landlord wants to. Oh, I went backwards and not forwards. So typically, as I said, this comes into play when the landlord, has future plans for the property and wants to do certain tests. If the landlord does this and damages crops, or parties working for the landlord damages crops, they're typically going to owe you damages for those crops. And that's when we have to go ahead and figure out, sort of, nope, what's going on? Computer froze up. Don't know what happened there. Okay, so what's the best way to fix all of this, solve all of these issues? Go back to what I said at the very start. Put it in writing. It provides a record. You can lay out what to do in situations discussed above. It's going to help settle disputes down the road. Hey, I have a fact sheet available for you. You can go there, get a copy of it. You can go on the extension website, just Google Ag Leases. There's samples available for download there. You can download them all there. That stuff will work. So what's the wrap up? If you run into an issue with farmland leasing, just call me. I'm happy to help. Email me too. I typically respond to emails sometimes faster than I respond to phone calls, just because I'm never in the office and I'm traveling. And sometimes when I'm traveling, I don't really have the ability to call folks back as quickly as I would like or they would like. Use the leasing guide. It's available to assist you. There's other leasing documents up there as well you can utilize as well. Another thing I do through my department, I do this blog. It's updated periodically at agris.umd.edu. You can sign up for information there. I do a podcast as well, although I've slacked off for the past few months and haven't gotten episodes out, but I need to get back into the habit of doing that. And hopefully I'll have some time here in the next couple of weeks to get it done. The last thing is become an early adopter. We have put this together. It's been going for about a year now. We're officially got a lot of the kinks worked out of the website. We're hoping to get it to go, officially available and pushed out to a lot more folks. And the deal. And although we're not in the southern region for at least extension programming purposes, a lot of our crop issues, poultry issues, and a few others do mirror some of the things that happen in the South as well. So you can sign up for this. This is a product from the Southern Ag Extension Economist, southernagtoday.org. It's a daily, or basically a weekday blog that will pump out 5 posts a week from policy, farm management, farm finance, trade, specialty crops, community development, cooperatives, ag law. Ag law is typically on Fridays. I'm a part of that group and helping as one of the co-leads on that. So please check that out. I can't take any questions, mainly because I'm not there today, and this is all just a recording. But if you have questions, here's my contact info. You can email me, shoot me questions. I'll get back with you. Find me on Instagram and Twitter at AgLawPaul. Thank you guys for listening. And hopefully I did not keep you too long, and you will be able to go about your day and enjoy the rest of it.